Hello, everyone. We are super excited to have you on this masterclass. We're going to be talking about how to hunt and scout prairie grouse, whether that's Huns, Sharpies, chickens. And I've got two awesome guests with me, Mr. Tyler Webster and Marissa Jensen. And uh, between the two, they have an absolute wealth of knowledge. And I'm personally really fired up to be here because we've only got a few weeks left until a lot of seasons started, and I'm just getting fired up. It's that time of year, so we're gonna give it a few minutes and let people kind of roll on in here. But just remember that you are muted. We can't see you, so don't worry. You can talk, etc. Um, if you want to re-watch some of this information, it'll be posted on YouTube probably tomorrow. And if you want to ask questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A so we can check them out versus the chat. Don't use the chat for asking questions because we can monitor the Q&A. But let's get things fired up here. And if you're in the chat, let's see where you're calling in from and what you're looking forward to hunting first this year. So I know Tyler is getting ready to go on quite a bird hunting adventure, to say the least.
Yeah, tomorrow morning, 6:30 in the morning, me and a buddy of mine, Bruce, we are taking off for Alaska. We got a 49-hour drive. We got the trailer loaded. We had to go and buy a deep freeze today because, I'm just anticipating needing a deep freeze to bring back everything that we're going to get on this trip. But we got a 49-hour drive up there. We're going to hunt for a couple weeks, going to do some fishing, chase some ptarmigan around. Then we're cruising down the West Coast to Oregon, and we're going to go and hunt mountain quail and valley quail with our buddy Nate Akey. And then from there, we're going to do the grouse slam coming back across Montana. So in Montana, they got 5 different species of grouse, and we've been doing this now for the last 3 years, and it's a ball.
Man, that's awesome. I know we were talking about it before we started here, and Marissa, I could see a little bit of jealousy poking through.
Just a little bit, just a tiny bit.
Where are you starting? You starting at in your home state then, chasing Sharpies and chickens?
Yeah, that's the plan. We're still pretty warm here, but I'm hoping by September 1st, when things open up for us, that we'll have a nice breeze blow through so that we can get out and start chasing some birds. But I don't know. I'm pretty sure I'm going to drive all night, and Tyler's going to be surprised when I show up at 6 in the morning, ready to go with my bags packed. So
I got some extra room in the trailer. We got a bigger trailer than we need. So, as long as you're all right riding back there with the gasoline and generator and everything else we're taking with,
Perfect.
We're not monsters. We'll punch an air hole in there for you. You'll be fine.
That's all I need.
Well, the dogs will be riding in the cab, but I'm
right.
sorry you're.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get it.
Yeah, we had a discussion about putting the dog kennels in the back, and I'm just not comfortable with putting them in a trailer. So we got one dog kennel in the back seat of the truck, and then the other 2 are ratchet strapped down in the box. So they're going to be riding in comfort, and everything else is, Marissa can ride back there with the rest of the luggage.
That's awesome. Well, I think a number of people are pouring in. It looks like you guys are located all over the country, so I'm really happy to have you guys on here. It should be a fun evening, and hopefully you learn something. I'm looking forward to learning something. So let's just go ahead, and I'd love to introduce my guests a little bit further if you're not familiar with them. Marissa, you want to take the wheel and introduce yourself?
Sure. So Marissa Jensen, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I work for Pheasants Forever as the Education and Outreach Program Manager. So although I'm based in Nebraska, I do work across the country. As part of our Women on the Wing initiative, I lead that initiative, just introducing women to the outdoors and work in conservation leadership. And I did not grow up hunting. I was an adult onset hunter. And so I'm really excited to be here to share just a little bit different perspective, as I'm a little bit newer to the game than Tyler and Ben here. But I'm looking forward to it. And I'm definitely looking forward to learning from you both as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you do your fair share. Every time I see pictures, you're on top of them. So
I would say the prairie grouse is where my heart is. We go out every single year for them, and I've got 2 German short hair pointers. So it's
awesome.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Mr. Webster.
Yeah, I'm
Where-
I'm Tyler Webster. I'm the host of the Birds, Booze, and Buds podcast. And this is going to be my 31st year chasing birds around here in North Dakota. Started carrying a shotgun when I was 8, and I don't plan on stopping until, I'm no longer able to stand up. Everything's just kind of gotten crazy here in the last 10 years. I've started traveling outside of North Dakota, and now my seasons consist of 130 plus days a year in the field, chasing everything from this year ptarmigan way up in Alaska all the way to Mearns quail down on the border of Arizona. And I think I bought licenses in 10 states last year, I think. And the year before that, I think it was 10 or 11. So I've just started, I've really got the bug to travel and try to figure out these new birds and new places. And it's taken me on some pretty awesome adventures.
Yeah, that is quite a life. I know there's a lot of people that would love to be doing that. And
talk to me in November when I look like I haven't slept since August. It's because I haven't slept since August. So
true.
Nobody feels bad. Nobody does.
I know. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Well, so what kind of the scheduled outline for tonight, what we're going to be going through is, first off, we're going to be talking through 3 species primarily. We're going to be talking about the Sharp-tailed Grouse, the Prairie chicken, and Hungarian Partridge. And so what we're going to kind of do is show you how on the map to figure out where you need to go. We're not going to be dropping coordinates. We're not going to be telling you. We're going to teach you how to find those spots so you can go out and do it yourself. So that's kind of what we're going to get into. First, though, I'm going to go into our web map. So obviously, a lot of you have it on your phone. If you're not familiar, we have it on the computer as well. If you go to onxmaps.com, you can go log in, same credentials as your app. And I can't speak for Marissa or Tyler, but I have a feeling the web map is what I use for scouting pretty much exclusively. It's a bigger screen. It's a little easier to navigate, larger screen. You've got your keyboard, everything there. So that's where I do most of my scouting. I don't know about you two. Is that the same?
I use the app on my phone almost exclusively. You don't go anywhere without your phone nowadays. So if I'm sitting in an airport or bored at the dentist's office or whatever the heck I'm doing, I just jump on onX and start looking. But I do know, just from having you up here the last couple of years and talking with you, I know that you use the web maps almost exclusively, and it's a nice tool for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would echo what Tyler said. I'm just so used to using it on my phone, but now that you say that, I think maybe I'll enjoy a larger screen. I'll check that out this year.
Well, it's a great way to kill a few hours during the work week. So
fair. Yeah. I mean, wait. You work? You never work. Are you kidding me? The only person who works less around here than I do is maybe you.
Nobody's getting their mail.
No, I know. Yeah. Well, I got employees for that. I'll blame them if the mail doesn't get delivered on time.
There you go. Awesome. So just to remind you guys again, everyone listening, you are muted. We can't see you. So if you want to ask any questions, be sure to put them in that Q&A, not the chat. We'll be answering questions from the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Also, at the end of the webinar, we're going to be doing giveaways of the onX Upland XT. So we're going to be posting a link in the chat so you can go sign up to win that. But without further ado, we'll kick it off here. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start just kind of going over the basics of, not necessarily the basics, but kind of the fundamentals that you need pretty much anywhere to find birds. So what I kind of like to tell people is that, one feature in the app isn't going to necessarily find you the birds. It's the combination of multiple different things coming together. That's going to kind of help paint a better picture for you. So kind of the crux of onX, as most of you probably know, is our land ownership data. And it's fantastic for finding public land, private land, a lot of the programs where you can, private land open to sportsmen, WEHA, that kind of thing. So the layers that I always turn on is going to be private, your government lands. So we're in Kansas right now, for example. They have your walk-in hunting lands. And then sometimes a lot of states will have some interesting possible access. So I don't see it as much out in the west, but for example, like in the grouse woods, there are a lot of these big timber companies will have land that is it's private land, right? The timber company owns it, but they will let people hunt it, and it will highlight it in this layer. The one thing to take note of is that you definitely want to confirm before you just go on this possible access land. Go Google, hey, for example, up here it's Blandin Paper Company. I'd Google Blandin Paper Company hunting and go read the regulations. But that can also open up a ton of different pieces of property acreage in the area. But be sure to double check that you can legally access it. So those are a lot of the state layers. Again, like Montana, they've got their block management, and they also have this Montana Game Bird Project. I know this has been a nice one for Tyler. If you're in North Dakota, the ND electronically posted land, that's just because of the unique land access laws in North Dakota. You can see what you're able to hunt, everything in red you can't hunt. So those are like the main land ownership layers. And then we get into some of the pretty cool things that helps paint that picture better for you. And we're going to be going through this when we talk about how to scout for each species. But we've got this crop distribution layer where you're able to go, I think it's 19 different crops. You're able to select different crops, and it is a year behind with crop rotations. But if you kind of have an understanding in that area of how those crops are rotated, you can kind of figure out what it's going to be the following year. And this is huge, even just going to a new area and figuring out what's on the landscape. So that is another great tool, and we're going to dive into that more as well. Another one that I like to use is I'll always turn on my roads and trails. So depending what areas it's, it might have a lot more trails, might have less, but this kind of highlights either if you can potentially walk down it or you can drive down it and help with access points, etc. Marissa said, so I have never used this, but Marissa brought up earlier this slope angle tool, and it pretty much is going to highlight the different gradients. And like I say, you learn something every day, and this is going to be pretty awesome for finding different terrain features at a glance. So when you go down to base map, so when we're looking at just the map in general, you have a few different options. You have the topo map, which is not going to show you aerial imagery. It's just going to show you essentially the topo lines. Hybrid is a combination of the topography. You can see the lines as well as satellite imagery. And then satellite is just going to be, no topo lines with the imagery. I pretty much run hybrid all the time.
Me too.
Marissa, is that same thing? Yep.
Yeah, I really like that option.
Yeah. Another feature that was launched recently, and it's great for a lot of the people hunting in more of the flatland areas outside of the mountainous areas, is that in 3D, you can use this elevation exaggeration. So you can really, even if it's flat out, you can bump that up and really see what that elevation looks like. Because if it's flat, I mean, this is relatively flat. It's hard to see, but you bump that up and you really can start to see what that topography looks like. And that's going to come into play as Marissa and Tyler discuss a lot of their spots or how to find them and what those spots look like. So I'm sure I'm missing something. Oh, waypoints. We use a lot of waypoints. So we'll talk about that further as well. But I think we're ready to kind of kick it off. I think we're going to start with Sharpies and how to find them one more thing. Before we kick that off, the biggest thing is finding where they live, right? Like if I'm coming from, say, the Southeast and I've never hunted them before, it's important to know where to hunt them, like where to even go to find a huntable population, right? So you can go just Google Sharp-tailed Grouse range or distribution, and it's going to you can get an idea where to go. Because like, for example, if I'm trying to find Sharpies in Iowa, or far western Montana, well, A, you can't hunt them out there, but you're going to have a bad time. So this is a great way to get you kind of in the ballpark. And then, yeah, so from there, like Tyler, we'll start with you. And the one thing that's interesting between Marissa and Tyler, a lot of the times, I mean, there's sharp-tailed grouse, obviously in Nebraska and North Dakota, Montana, but the juxtaposition between the cover is so interesting. So be sure to really, be sure to listen to both angles, because even in the short time we were talking before, you're picking up on little things that have similarities while being the same species in two very different places. So Tyler, if you want to kick things off and just kind of start out talking about what you do to go about finding them.
So I guess before we even start talking about what kind of habitat they live in, we should talk about kind of the way that they run seasonally. So and what I mean by that is sharp-tails up here are born toward middle to the end of June. And throughout the summer months, they rely exclusively on soft-bodied insects as their total source of food. And so as season starts in most states, whether it's September 1 here in North Dakota, it doesn't start until the second Saturday in September, or whatever the date is. It doesn't, most years, pretty much every year, they're still going to be relying almost wholly on insects. When you open up a crop on a sharp-tailed grouse, it's going to be stuffed full of grasshoppers primarily. And then as the season rolls through, after we get a couple frosts and all those insects die off, you'll see them kind of transition away from those insects and more onto the berries and the wild fruit that lives out in the prairie, whether it would be rose hips or snowberries or chokecherries or whatever it is. And then as the season goes on past that, then they'll start taking advantage of more of the crop that's off. So whether it's sunflower fields or corn or wheat or whatever it might be, you'll see huge flocks of sharp-tails or prairie chickens, both. We can talk about this in prairie chickens as well, that'll just be flying for miles. And I mean, all the sharp-tails from all the pieces of prairie, they've kind of not totally exhausted that berry supply out there on the landscape, but it's starting to, it's not good anymore. That you'll still find rose hips, for example, in the crops all the way through the season because they stay kind of good still, I suppose. But you'll see sharp-tails just kind of flying you're like, where in the heck are these birds going? Well, they got a field in mind that they're feeding in. And if you find one of those fields, you can find literally hundreds of sharp-tails at times. So as my season starts, if I'm out walking in the prairie, whether it's North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, and if I'm not seeing grasshoppers, that's a really good sign that you're not going to find a lot of birds, because those young birds of the year, they have to have that to survive. That they don't have a gizzard yet. They can't process any kind of grains. I mean, they have a gizzard, but it's not working up to capability yet. So if I'm walking along, and me and Ben, when you were up here a couple years ago and we did that e-scouting video for onX, the first spot that we went to had a total lack of insects, and we walked across it, and it like a mile into it, I was like, there's no bugs here. But what there was a ton of berries. There was a ton of chokecherries and plums and rose hips and all that, Russian olives and all that kind of stuff. And so I made a mental note of that. I was like, this is going to collect birds as the year goes on, because there was just so much life in that field, but there just wasn't any bugs for whatever reason. I don't know why there was grasshoppers there the year before and not that year, but there wasn't. So if I'm walking along and if I don't have grasshoppers jumping up and hitting my arms or sticking to my pant legs, I'm probably going to go and move down the road just a little ways and see if there's bugs down there. And then after that first freeze, then you can really start diving into their home territory, like the prairie, the proper prairie, where a lot of times you're going to find bugs as well as berries. But as I'm walking across the landscape, me and Marissa were talking about it before we started recording. You should see not a monoculture of grass. It should be a bunch of different types of grass. You should see little clumps of buckbrush and chokecherry thickets and Russian olives and different height grass and different densities. And I'm also going to be looking for the rolling topography. So as the season goes on after that, and it gets a little bit later into the year and it starts, yeah, exactly right. There's my little dog CJ out there just crushing it. As the season goes on after that and it starts getting colder, you'll actually see the sharp-tails start moving into some of the thicker patches in the pieces of prairie, Or the other thing that you can find them in occasionally is what looks like traditional pheasant CRP. I have found them in late November and December up here when you got some snow on the ground. They'll actually snow roost just like a rough grouse will. And they'll get into that CRP and they'll bury themselves in there, and they got that good thermal protection against the cold. But the way I always try to explain it to people is that if you're walking across a piece of ground in September and you're expecting to jump pheasants, you're not in the right area. Like, that's not what the cover should look like. It's entirely too tall and entirely too thick. So those are just a couple of the things that I wanted to get into before we even started talking about what I'm looking for in the field.
And Marissa, how does that between seasonality and some of that, how does that work down further south in Nebraska? Is it pretty similar? Are there, obviously probably some differences?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities. As Tyler mentioned, those insects, those soft-bodied insects in the very beginning of a bird's life is primarily what they're feeding off of. So we talk a lot about pollinator habitat. So I'm looking for pollinator habitat. I'm looking for diversity of forbs, so different kinds of wildflowers, different types of grasses. So when I look at a landscape and I see different heights, different thickness, different colors, that to me looks like an area that I really want to check for birds, because there's that possibility of the abundance of insects. And then with that, you're going to find an abundance of birds. And I'm just chuckling to myself when Tyler mentioned, if you don't have insects jumping at you, I mean, that's when you've hit the best spot. You've got them bouncing off your firearm and your arms and your legs, and it's so frustrating, but you're like, this is it. This is the best spot. What's interesting to me is a lot of the places where I've successfully, when we have greater prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse kind of in similar vicinity, is that I'm looking for a much higher peak to some of the hills that we have in the area versus some of those softer rolling hills, whereas that's where I'm going to find the prairie chickens. So I'm paying a lot of attention to the height of the hills, the steepness of the hills, if there's blowouts on the sides and bowls and things like that. So those are some of the things that I look at over the year, and that can be pretty consistent across the season. And with prairie chickens as well, I mean, it's just very consistent. They're going to have those soft-bodied insects. When I'm looking at a crop early season, it's just grasshoppers and maybe some grubs, but just grasshoppers. Mm-hmm. And then you start to see the rose hips. You start to see some of those other berries later on as well. So, I think it's interesting to hear how, there are some similarities and differences, but for the most part, it's pretty consistent.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, so like up in Tyler's neck of the woods, you get a lot of that, like the chokecherry bushes, buffalo berry. I mean, it gets fairly tall, right? I mean, those chokecherry bushes are huge. A lot of the buffalo berries are what, Tyler? It'd be waist for me, probably knee for you.
Yeah, I mean, the thickets of the chokecherry bushes, they can be, I mean, 10 feet tall. And after the leaves come off, is what you see underneath of there is not a lot of weeds. Like, it's kind of open underneath there. And so is what they use it for is they use it for cover from avian predators. Like, it's one of those things that they can kind of get in there, they can forage around, they can eat all the berries off the ground, all that kind of stuff, but it protects them from hawks, even though that they're more or less exposed. I mean, when you walk up to them, I've had it happen a lot of times. I mean, basically every year, you'll walk up to a doggone point and you'll look underneath the bush and you can see sharp-tails just kind of scurrying all over the place in there. And at that point, you're hosed because they're going out the other side of the bush and you're just like, you're standing there on the wrong side of the bush. But I mean, like, you're talking about the buckbrush and all that kind of stuff. I don't typically find them in the buckbrush. I'll find them on the edges of it. So, like, I mean, the way I look at the prairie is kind of the same way I look at a wheat field or whatever when I'm dissecting it for hunts. I'm looking for the edges. Like, there's always edges. It's the edges of the bushes. It's the patches of buckbrush around them. The little dips and bowls that Marissa was talking about. It's all edges. And if you can kind of start training your eye to look at it as that and not as just kind of a big landscape, you can kind of start picking apart the smaller little objectives inside of a field. And I'll tell you what's even more interesting is that the more you hunt with a dog, your dog will start to pick apart those parts. Like you'll see, like my dog Rusty is 9 years old and has probably been on more sharp-tails than most dogs in the world. He can get up on top of the hill and you'll just see him kind of like looking around, and he's like, there should be birds there and there and there and there, and he'll just go and he'll just hit all of them. And like I hunt it the same way. I'm looking for those edges. I'm looking for the downwind side of the hill. They don't like to be up on top where they're super exposed. They like to be on the edges. But that's the way that I'm looking at it. I'm not necessarily hunting through the middle of that stuff, though occasionally you will put a bird up out of the middle of it. But a lot of times you're kind of just getting fooled by randomness. Like that bird just landed in there or whatever, for whatever reason. But if you just kind of focus more on the edges of that stuff rather than going through the middle of it, you'll do better.
Yeah.
So, I was gonna say, Marissa, like, so we were talking, like what I brought out originally about, like the tall chokecherry buffalo berries. Like, do you see that as much in Nebraska? Do you get that big tall cover? Is it shorter? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so we certainly have, plum thickets, and you can get into some of the, sumac cherries, things like that. Obviously when I'm scouting online, when I'm scouting in person, I'm trying to find, just vast open spaces, because the other thing that we run into that I think is probably, struggle that we all run into is, just encroachment with eastern red cedars and other trees. And so I'm trying to find places that don't have as much of that really tall structure. But the plums and the chokecherries, those are all really beneficial. And when I think about some of those things too, I'm not only thinking about food, but I'm also thinking about protection from the elements. So you think about how hot it can get in some of our states, and the shade. Where does the shade come from? Absolutely. So I'm going to look for some of those thickets to see if there's birds that are, in the shade. I'm going to look at the side of a hill that the sun's hitting in the morning. If it's been a really dewy, wet morning and they're going to be drying out and warming up in the sun, or, as Tyler mentioned, being on the opposite side of, if the wind's really blowing, those birds are going to be up and over in an area hunkered down, protect them from the wind. They don't want to be exposed to the elements, really high up there. So those are also things that, obviously change depending on each day's weather. But, things to take into consideration. The other thing, and I'd love to hear how many, if you guys have experienced this too, but even driving around scouting, I've come across multiple Sharpies, like a sentinel that sits there, and then I have to try and navigate, like, how am I going to walk into this group? Because that bird is going to just call me out right when he sees me. And so it's really interesting. They'll have a single bird that sits on a higher structure and basically will alert the rest of the flock to danger. And so that's a whole nother challenge that they throw our way.
Yeah. Yeah. If the way that I've always looked at it is, if I can see the sharp tail, I know I'm already done for. Like, I mean, I'm just going to, you win today, buddy. I'll come back and see you another day, because you're exactly right. And it seems like later in the season, you'll see that a lot more often. Early in the year, the juvenile birds they don't know what danger is really yet. I mean, they're getting hunted from aerial predators all day, and occasionally a fox or a coyote will grab one, but not real often. They're relatively quick to that game, and the learning curve is very steep. I mean, either they learn or they're dead. But as the season goes on and they've ran into more hunters and dogs and everything else, they just kind of, they're a super wary bird. And I mean, if for those people out there that have never done it before, the first thing that I always tell everybody is that if you want to go and hunt sharp-tails or prairie chickens, and you want to actually have success in harvesting the bird, not just seeing lots of them, go early in the year. Because like after the 1st of October, the number of sharp-tails that I successfully hunt goes way down. And I'm sure it's like that across the board. It's not just because my focus switches to huns and pheasants. My focus switches to huns and pheasants because sharp-tails gets to be so dang tough. And I've seen them sitting on top of highline wires and in trees and on hay bales and everything else. And I think, to your point too, Marissa, the part of the reason why those birds kind of hunker down on the downwind side of those hills, it's definitely want to get out of the wind, but a lot of it is they don't like not being able to hear. And if they're up there on top of those hills, that wind's whistling by, it makes them really exposed. They can't hear anything coming up on them at all. And so they'll just kind of tuck down where they can see everything that's coming on the upwind side of them. And then they can hear everything on the upwind side and see everything on the downwind side. So they don't like to be on the tops of the hills. They don't like to be in the bottoms. They like to be kind of right there in the middle, right on those edges. And I think that if you focus on those areas, you'll do pretty well.
Yeah, so somebody asked a great question, and they said, like, all right, well, what does that look like on a map, right? Like, all right, I can, go Google what this looks like, but how do I find them? So, Tyler, I'll start with you. I'll share my screen on an area that we had talked about, and just kind of dissect this for us. And this is a good spot, and just help explain to people what they're seeing and why this is good.
Sure. So the first thing that I'm looking at on this particular map is I'm seeing a lot of contour lines. And in North Dakota, the contour lines aren't going to be as drastic as they are in some places. It's going to be a lot more of that subtle kind of rolling hills. And so I'm looking at all these contour lines. I can kind of right off the bat, I'm going to eliminate all these low-lying areas that have water in them and around them. Like, if you see all this stuff down here towards the bottom where it says that lake and you can see the 2250 foot line mark, I'm going to eliminate everything south or below that 200 or the 2250 foot line. Now I'm seeing all the little bushes and stuff like that are kind of on the sides of the hills, like towards the bottoms, like probably 3/4 of the way down. I'm going to go and give those a look, especially on a windy day. Because like Marissa was talking about, they like to tuck out of the wind, or on a really warm day. That's a really good point that I didn't even think of. But every year you'll get an 80-degree day and you'll be out there hunting. And, I personally won't hunt my dogs if it's over about 73 or 74 degrees. Like, it just gets too hot too fast. And one thing that I would definitely like to tell people while I'm thinking about it is that even though on this particular map, you can see a lot of water here, I wouldn't count on being safe for your dogs, because early in the year until we get a freeze, blue-green algae is a real concern. And you want to know what that looks like. And I will always approach water from the upwind side, because that blue-green algae will actually float on the surface and it'll go to the downwind side and it'll pile up on the banks and stuff like that. So even if the water is bad and you come to the upwind side, the toxicity in the water isn't enough where it's going to be of real concern to your dog. It's definitely something you don't want to get him into. But just because there's a lot of water on the map, it doesn't mean that it's going to be safe for your dog to drink. That's a real concern until it gets cooler in the year, in October or whatever. But getting back to the birds. So if it's a really nice calm day, I personally don't really like to start hunting sharp-tails until about 10 a.m. I like them to get out and feed in the morning and then kind of get back into their kind of roosting cover. I mean, we all know what we feel like after we've had a Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. We're kind of sluggish. We want to kind of relax. We want to kind of lay on the sofa and watch football or whatever. So the sharp-tails version of that is to kind of get into their loafing cover and kind of bury in there and just kind of relax. And at that point, their guard's down. So like, they're not super alert. They don't have those sentinels up, just like Marissa was talking about. So if you start hunting at like 10 in the morning, as long as the weather's not going to be too hot, and you stop at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's going to be your best opportunity for the best dog work. So if it's a nice calm day, I'll actually take the tops of some of these and I'll let my dog kind of work a lot, and I'll just kind of see what's out there. As the wind starts to pick up, and by wind in North Dakota, I mean like anything over 10 miles an hour. If it's less than 10 miles an hour, it doesn't seem like it really bothers the birds, especially in September when it's 65 degrees outside and it's not real hot or not real cold. I'll actually take some of these darker patches of the cover up on the tops, and then I'll kind of see where my dog wants to go, and I'll kind of start following the dog a little bit. But as you look at this piece of property, and like there right on the right-hand side of the screen, Ben, you can see that green patch right there in the middle.
What are we looking at there?
Yeah, so is what that is, that's just different types of grass. So like when I was talking earlier about finding edges inside of a big, massive field, that's an edge that I'm going to look at. So that's a different height grass, and it's going to probably be a different thickness and a different type of grass. So I'm going to go and I'm going to explore all those little spots that look kind of like that. You can see that actually right up there by where your cursor's at. You see that big flat spot? I would bet $1 that's probably a lek, actually. That looks very similar to a lek. But if you kind of start following some of these contour lines around and just kind of hitting all these little patches in there, and working all the creases and the tops. And I'm not one for getting on a ridge and just following it forever. I'll kind of go up and down as the terrain goes, because you never really know. And like once you find a group of sharptails, you're going to kind of find the rest of them on roughly the same elevation. It seems like they really kind of follow that pattern. So until I kind of start getting a really good feel of where those birds are going to be at today, whether it's cloudy or sunny, or there's high humidity, or there's dew on the grass in the summer or in the early fall, you don't really actually know where they're going to be for those days. Now, as you come down here, I'm going to hit all those little patches of bushes. Like these are little fingers. And again, depending on the time of the year, especially if the insects have died off, those are going to be spots as when the insects die off, as Marissa brought up earlier as well. That generally means it's starting to get a little bit cooler out. So as you get down to those bushes, you're going to find a little bit taller grass along the edges, but it's still going to be kind of open on the slope going down to it. So they'll kind of feed down towards those bushes, and then they'll kind of feed back up in the evenings. But a lot of times you'll find those birds in those bushes midday.
Yep. So Tyler, how does this change in your area? Like, do they later in the year, are you just really keying more in on the thicker stuff?
Yeah, for me, I am. And by late season for me, I mean November, December. I mean, in October up here, and just like down in Nebraska and in Montana, we can get some very warm days, or we can get some very cold days. And it's just going to kind of all depend on the weather. I personally don't really go out and chase sharptails a lot if it's going to be cold and windy, or if it's going to be windy and overcast or anything like that, especially later in the year, because as we were talking about earlier, those birds are very wary, and they're just exceptionally flighty when it's windy out. So if I'm going to try to hunt late season, say from mid-October through December, it's going to be a warm, calm, sunny day. And it's going to kind of follow along with the same timeline that I was talking about, where, let them get out and feed in the morning, and especially late in the year, because those birds might go a long ways. They might be flying miles to go to food, and then miles back after they get done eating. But if you wait until those afternoon hours, you can still get some birds off point, even later in the year.
Yeah. So if you're looking at this map from like a straight down 2D aerial mode, you can really see the different color, like the different color on the screen. Like you'll see this is light up here, it's a tan.
Yeah, the lighter is going to be thinner grass. It's going to be shorter.
Yeah, whereas like you can see like this would be a patch of probably chokecherry, right,
yep.
Tyler?
Yep, that would be my bet.
Like you said, like just finding this mosaic is really important.
And if you look over here on the left side of the screen, if you zoom back in, those are actually willow bushes is what those are. Because I actually know this particular piece of property. And anybody from Minnesota that's watching this that hunts in northwestern Minnesota knows that if you can find some willow bushes, sometimes, especially like late September, early October, you're probably going to find some sharptails. And it does work here as well. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is for, kind of North Dakota, Western Montana, or Central Montana, this starts to change, but yep. This holds pretty true for, would you say, North Dakota?
I would say
side of Montana, South Dakota?
For sure. Yeah. South Dakota is a little bit different. The primary strongholds of sharptails in South Dakota are going to be, everybody knows the Fort Pierre National Grassland is, it's amazing. It's a great place to go and burn some calories and walk some miles. The difference down there is that there's not as many bushes, very few bushes. I've found a lot of birds more on the transition of the taller grass to the shorter grass. So again, it's all about looking for those edges. I think you were talking about Johnson's grass earlier, Marissa, and that's kind of what you're looking for when you're hunting chickens. And I've kind of found that in South Dakota as well, where when I'm looking for sharptails and chickens, I'm primarily down there. In fact, I get a little bit upset if I shoot a sharptail down there, because I shoot lots of sharptails. I like to chase chickens when I'm in the grasslands. And if I see a dog on point, kind of like relatively close to some taller grass, I'm expecting prairie chickens. And that's when I'm like, oh, here we go. Like, this is going to get good. But if you wait, I've flushed sharptails and prairie chickens, and the prairie chickens almost always come out of that little bit taller grass, and the sharptails will be on the edge of it. So, I mean, you're still looking for the same edges. You're just looking at a landscape that's a little bit different and is a little bit more subtle.
So like I'm down in South Dakota right now. You can see, like Tyler was saying, that there isn't like the pronounced bushes, right? Like you can see on this hillside though, you can see that discrepancy in color, right? The darker stuff's gonna be a little bit taller, probably gonna be bushes. Same thing like up here, these are all little patches of bushes. Probably gonna be pretty likely haunts.
Yeah.
Versus, I'm let's see if I can just find a spot that I wouldn't go. I mean, this probably isn't as desirable.
Well,
right?
the one thing about South Dakota and the Fort Pierre in particular that's definitely of note is it's a vast place, and don't waste your time on a piece that's been overly grazed. So as I'm driving across the grasslands, I'm looking at how much it's been grazed and if the height grass looks correct. I mean, and year to year, we run through some pretty intense droughts every once in a while, and you'll see that grass get grazed down to nothing. You can find birds out there occasionally because they don't have any place else to go, especially earlier in the year, because there's still going to be a lot of grasshoppers around, but they're going to be really hard to approach. And on top of that, you're just burning a lot of calories and you're kind of burning up your dog without putting any of the odds in your favor. So if you can kind of spend a little bit more windshield time, which everybody hates, I don't like it either. I hate driving around looking at different pieces. I want to get out there and start walking. But if you spend a little bit more time and you actually concentrate on the areas that do look good, you're going to do a lot better, and you're not going to be having so many dry walks.
Yeah. So then, Marissa, as we transition, let's transition down to kind of like your neck of the woods, and kind of what are some of the key things that you're really honing in on to find birds?
Yeah, so, I really prefer to try to find really, just massive stretches of land. 640 acres and above is what you're going to expect to find, a healthy population. And, we've got a lot of really great resources in the state of Nebraska where, it's 97% privately owned, but we have some really amazing public access opportunities and an excellent walk-in access program through our open fields and waters. That just opens up a lot of opportunities. So I will say that's one thing that, I definitely take advantage of. A lot of people will look for your typical, wildlife management areas and other, public access areas, and those privately owned but public access points, aren't used as much. And so I've found some really good opportunities where I will specifically look for a public access site, and then I'll look around it. And if there's an open fields and waters, I'll go there because it's probably not getting hit as much as the, WMA or whatever, other property is right there. The other thing I'm looking for is, again, making sure that there's not an abundance of trees in an area. Yeah, perfect. I'm looking at those topographical, like those contour lines. So I want to see a lot of contour lines. Specifically, if I'm getting into the sandhills, which is my favorite place in the entire state, I'm looking at how close those contour lines are together to identify, are those rolling hills or are they steep hills? If I really have a preference, and if I want to hunt sharp-tailed grouse over prairie chickens, I'm looking for those lines to be closer together. So, you can kind of see when the lines are closer together like that, that means that it's a steeper climb versus if they're further apart. And then, yes, the slope angle that I'm just
such a cool layer.
I'm so excited about it. Yeah. So it's really fun to look, and you zoom in onto the contour lines, and then you can actually see the degree. There in the top right corner of your screen, you can see the degree of the steepness of those areas. And so I'm looking for that. I'm looking for, a mixture of that vegetation. So kind of that mosaic that you guys were talking about before as well, when you're looking at the different, grassland cover in there. I'll find chickens in a little bit thicker, a little bit taller habitat than the sharp-tailed grouse. And, although you want to be cautious of overgrazed areas, I will look for working ranches. I've had a lot of wonderful success hunting on public access sites where cattle are in the area. Obviously, you want to be very respectful of those places and really work with your dogs to make sure that there's no struggles with your dogs and the cattle. But especially if there's rotational grazing, rotational prescribed fires, those make amazing spots to hit. And so I'll really try and kind of find some of those areas as well.
When you talk about like preferred grass height, what does that look like for Sharpies down in your area?
Yeah, so for Sharpies, I really don't. I mean, calf high is about what I'm wanting, and it's funny. I had like the perfect example of it this last year where I was walking into a property and it was knee high and we flushed chickens. And then we kept walking and the grass got shorter and shorter and shorter. And then there were the Sharpies. And I wish I could have just recorded it because it was just the perfect example of some of the differences in habitats that they enjoyed. It's not to say that, they don't break the rules every now and again, but I'm looking for a lot thinner, shorter habitat for the sharp-tailed grouse. I'm looking for, that open area for them to move around. The one thing that, we haven't touched on yet that I do just want to mention, especially if, individuals have, if they're pheasant quail hunters and they're not used to prairie grouse hunting, prairie grouse are they fly much further than your pheasant and your quail. They're not as likely to run. Now they will. Every time I think they won't, they will. But their breast meat is going to be red because they're using the blood vessels in that area so much more, and they're flying much further distance. And so they hold a lot tighter, especially early in the season because they don't run as much. So one thing that I always like to tell people is if you see a group of birds flush and you miss, or they're too far away and you're frustrated, get up there to that spot because I guarantee that there's a couple birds that are holding on there for you that didn't move. I've seen it time and time and time again. I've been victim of it time and time again. There's always one more bird that's sitting there. So just something to keep in mind before I forget.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good point too, because I don't know how many times I've yelled at people. Like the first bird goes out at like 45, 50 yards and they waste their 2 shots at it and they got their gun open. I'm like, get more shells in that thing and move closer because I swear to God, there's more birds.
Yeah. The other thing, is when you're looking at the map and you're looking at the different elevations, one of the things that I like to do, Tyler, you said you didn't like to kind of walk the ridges necessarily. And it definitely depends on the time of year. It depends on how tired I am and what I feel like climbing, how many dogs I have that can cover an area. But I do, afternoon, and I like to kind of hit the lower areas and cover some of that loafing ground. In the mornings, I'll kind of hit the peaks, but there's a big difference too, I feel like when it's early and late season. And when it's late season and those birds are spooky, and, one of the things to mention is this, it's not just that they're educated. Prairie grouse, in early season, when it's warm, they're just kind of moving around, doing their thing. But when it gets cold, they start to group up together. And that's what makes them even more flighty in the winter is they feed off of each other. And once one goes, the rest of them will go. And so I'm really quiet in the winter if I'm hunting late season. And I'm bringing my dog in closer because even the best dogs can bump, these prairie grouse when it's late season. And I'm cresting hills with the idea if there's a bull on the other side or something, I'm going really quiet up one of those hills and then I'm popping over ready to go because 9 times out of 10, I'll get a flush that way. And it's just learning that topography, looking at that map, and then planning each hunt based on not only, where you want to go, but it's late season and this is the kind of topography that I'm experiencing. This is how I'm going to actually approach that hunt each time.
So for people out there that are kind of shaking their heads at us a little bit, when we say they're flighty, if you've never chased sharp-tailed grouse, So last year, there's a refuge not very far from where I live that it opens up right after deer season closes. So it's late November. And I got it in my head last year that there was a really nice day. It was going to be like 50 degrees. It was going to be sunny. There wasn't going to be any wind. I was like, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to shoot a limit of Sharp-tails with a 410. And I walked, no kidding, 14 miles and I never pulled the trigger, and I probably seen 500 birds. I mean, the closest I got to any of them was about 80 yards. And I was like, I mean, actually, I probably got to 50. I had a dog on point where it was a big group, just like you're describing. And the wind was blowing kind of right in her nose, and she stuck a point, and she was at least 60 yards away from these birds. There was like 40 of them. And I went walking up, and as soon as I got past her, like that internal clock kind of switches in your brain. You're like, oh, any minute now. And then all of a sudden I watch all these birds get up, and I was like, what? Are you serious? Like it's really, really hard. And when she's talking about being quiet, you're not yelling at dogs. You're certainly not using a whistle, and you're not slamming car doors. I mean, when you're walking up there, you're a little bit like Elmer Fudd, you know, you're kind of sneaking a little bit. And it's a great point, Marissa. Like when you come up over top of those ridges, be ready, because those birds are generally going to be in the top third of those hills. You know, they're going to be on the downwind side, but they're going to be in that top third. So a lot of times when you crest those hills, you're actually going to be within gun range. And if you go charging up there and you got your gun over your shoulder and everything else, you're not ready for that. And then all of a sudden you missed your one opportunity on a day where you walked a long ways.
Yeah. One thing I want to touch on before we transition more to chickens, otherwise we could sit, I'm sure the three of us all day, we could sit and talk about this for like 8 hours. So
I do actually, that's all I do.
Good point. So crops, when it comes to crops, that's something I look for when I'm chasing Sharpies. We have a great resource on onX. Is if you go to, let me share my screen here quick. If you go to your layers, you can go into trees, crops, and cover. And there'll be the U.S. crop distribution. Like I said before, this is last year's data. But the nice thing, so we're going to be talking about alfalfa a lot. That generally, depending on the area, anywhere from 4 to 7 year rotation. So if it's in there, if it's showing alfalfa on the map, the odds are it's going to still be there. So right now what I did is if you go into the sub layers, you can select all these different ones. So I have alfalfa on. You can see it flashing on the map there. So Marissa, I don't know if you want to touch on kind of your strategy for hunting crops and what that looks like.
Yeah, I don't know who just commented on it, but they said that alfalfa is the buggiest, and alfalfa is a great crop to look for when you're scouting for your prairie grouse. And if I'm finding an alfalfa field, if I'm finding corn, even soybean, and it's near a public access, I'm absolutely going to those places. Especially if alfalfa early season, if there's a lot of bugs in the area. But then as they transition to after those bugs kind of die off, they're going to go to berries, but there are going to be some grain and that they, will go after. So I'm looking for corn. I'm looking for soybean, and definitely alfalfa. Alfalfa is the number one that I really look for when I'm scouting for prairie grouse. So that's a really great resource to use on that map. And depending on, what crop that you want to hyper focus on. I mean, there's so many options there that it's a really great resource.
Yeah, with when you were talking about pollinators earlier, that's the first thing that came to my mind was alfalfa. When you walk through an alfalfa field, it's got all those little purple flowers and stuff like that on it, and it's a magnet for bugs all year long. I mean, when I'm going to be looking for sharp-tails, in fact, the spot that I hunt opening day every year, it's an alfalfa field not very far from here. In the last 5 years, we've shot a limit out of there on opening morning. And I will definitely focus on that in September. After September, I'm going to start looking for the pieces of prairie grass that are close to that. They're going to start kind of moving into some of that more traditional type habitat. The other thing that, like when you were talking about corn and sunflowers and soybeans and stuff like that, I had a really fun hunt past shooting prairie chickens down in the grasslands a couple years ago, and they were going into a cornfield. They were into a sunflower field. And I mean, it was just like hide behind a post. I mean, it's December. You're not gonna you didn't get real close to them most of the time, and you hide behind a post, and there'd be 10 or 12 that flew off to your right, and then 10 or 12 that flew off to your left, and then you're moving, picking. You're like, well, they're all going to come over there, and no, that's not how it works. They're just random as can be. But if you stand in one place, you can actually pass shoot them a little bit in late season.
Awesome. We can circle back if there's more questions, but any final touch points when it comes to Sharpies?
Get out there and do it. They're a ball, and they're great for dogs, especially early in the year. They will punish a little bit of sloppy dog work, but you're going to get enough opportunities if you pick a good spot. If you look at that distribution map and do some calling around to some of the state game biologists and different folks that know what they're talking about, you're going to be able to get into an area where you'll literally have a chance to, see plenty of birds for a dog to make mistakes, and they'll get tighter as you go on.
Yeah, and I would just add, and this certainly works for all the different, species that we're talking about, but these birds were, especially the sharp-tailed grouse, are really adapted for, colder climates. And, it's fun when you look at the bottom of their, their feet, and they've got, fur that's inside the nose and everything else. So they're going to be out moving around when it's cold, and look for tracks, look for droppings, look for, some of these areas when you're out hunting, you may find the roost site. And then again, mark that on onX and come back and visit it at different times. So just, something that you can, as you're hunting, you can continue to scout and mark those points to come back to at a later point.
Awesome. Yeah, all great advice. So I know we kind of touched on chickens kind of throughout the Sharpie bit.
I jumped the gun. I'm sorry. I get really excited about them.
So just kind of like going back to the start again, there is some overlap in the chicken Sharpie range. Generally, what is it like? You're kind of got that Kansas to South Dakota corridor that you're going to find most of the time. They don't get up into North Dakota at all, I don't think, do they, Tyler?
They have well, there's a season in Minnesota as well for
true.
chickens. You got to put in for a permit, but you can get drawn. They've tried reintroducing them to some spots in southeastern North Dakota. Very mixed success. But yeah, there you go. You can look up there by Grand Forks and Fargo and in that area up there. But if you get down into Kansas, there's not really any sharp tails down there. That's all chickens down there.
Yep. So that's, I mean, again, you're looking for an area to start, look at the distribution, right? That's going to help you along the way. So
come to Nebraska. We're the best.
Yeah, it's a good spot.
So I don't know. I mean, like I say, we've kind of covered a lot of it, but like, I mean, Tyler, Marissa, like you all right, I'm going out. I really want to shoot a chicken. Where are you starting? What's the prime habitat that you're looking for?
Yeah, so I'm gonna definitely look for that kind of mixed grass prairie. So I really have a general rule of no higher than knee high. That being said, I've certainly, after a really rainy spring, and I've found them in things that are grass that's up to my shoulders when it's just been a really wet spring. So again, they don't always follow the rules that we have for them, but typically knee high or less. I want to be able to walk through it with ease. I don't want it to be super thick. A very diverse abundance of forbs, so those wildflowers and legumes and grasses. The other thing that I specifically look for, especially in early season for chickens, is clover. They absolutely love clover. I went on a hunt earlier last year, and there was it was kind of overgrazed area, but I knew that there was typically a chicken, a flock a covey that lived in this area. And I saw this nice just stretch of clover and walked past it, nothing. The dogs didn't alert. Walked past it again, nothing. The dogs, and we just weren't right in the wind. And I was so determined. I was like, they have to be here. That is the most gorgeous like location for them. And finally, we came around a different direction, hit the wind right, and found 2 birds that were just sitting so tight. And again, early season, they just sit there. We've walked past birds so many times before when they sit tight like that. So I'm looking for clover. I don't see as many chickens in the extreme hills like I do the sharp-tailed grouse, excuse me. So I'm looking for more of those rolling hills. I'm looking for poison ivy. That's another plant that typically you can find them around. Obviously, use your caution there. But that's a good one as well to kind of look for. Rose hips all day, every day. One of my favorite plants. It's in my background here for those that could see. Both species of prairie grouse. Just absolutely love rose hips. If you ever go hunting with me, every time we see a rose hip, I will announce that there is a rose hip, just so that everybody's aware. And then I'm just looking for those dips again, and maybe not as extreme as the sharp-tailed grouse, but I'm looking for those dips. The other thing that I want to mention, and Tyler made a really good point about blue-green algae, but when I'm scouting for prairie grouse, I'm looking for windmills and I'm looking for water tanks, because I want to have worst case scenario access to water if my dogs are overheating, and dunk them in there if I absolutely have to. I prefer to bring as much water, but that's a lot of hiking, a lot of packing. So I'm looking for windmills, I'm looking for stock tanks, I'm looking for those types of things when I'm out there.
Awesome. Yep. Tyler, I know you're saying, a lot of your chicken experience is later in the year. What's your rundown on the old prairie chicken?
Well, so I have a real problem with leaving North Dakota and Montana in September and October. To be fair, I just don't do it. I'm here. So all my prairie chicken experiences come from the first part of December until the end of January. And it was like, I know it's nuts.
I'm sorry.
But I know it's crazy. But so the first time that I chased them was in Kansas. I was on my way back from Arizona after my yearly quail voyage. And I stopped mostly to hunt bobwhites in Kansas, in north central Kansas is where I was at. And I just talked to a buddy of mine, and he said, I got a good chicken spot. He said, it's like, and just like Marissa was saying, I like those spots that are very big. Like I don't want to get out of the truck, and like it's not like rough grouse hunting where you're going to walk like a 40-acre cut. None of that. Like I want to be able to just get my dogs out and let them go for miles. And he's like, I got the spot. We can park a truck on one end of it and we can start walking from the other. It's like 7 miles. I was like, I'm in. Like that sounds perfect. And it's late January, but it was a beautiful day. It was like, and I seriously can't stress the weather stuff enough, especially when it comes to late season. Late season, it's way more important than it is early in the year. But pick your days if you're going to try to chase these birds later in the year. Find those nice warm days. Find the days where it's kind of sunny and it's calm and it's, above seasonally warm, So if you're down in Kansas, like that particular day that I'm talking about, it was in the low to mid 50s, and it was very sunny, very calm. And I was like we kind of looked at the forecast for days ahead of time, and it just kept, it was that was going to be the day. And so we went out and we made a very long walk, and we've seen a lot of prairie chickens. And I was very close to the end of the walk before I got my first one. And then right after that, the dog's bringing one back. And just like Marissa said, occasionally, even late season, occasionally they will sit stupid tight. I mean, and so bird gets up, got a dog on point, shoot at bird. I'm all excited. I'm standing there, dog's bringing it back. I got the gun over the shoulder. There's nobody there. So I'm high-fiving myself. And lo and behold, another one jumps up, and I got a second one. And that's the limit in Kansas is 2. And I couldn't have been happier. I mean, 6.5 miles I went before I got to pull the trigger, and I'd seen probably 70 or 100 other chickens. And then all of a sudden I got my chance and I made it count. The one thing that I would like to tell people that it kind of took me by, I'm sorry, I'm sitting out in my garage and there's flies and they're just swarming my nose. But the one thing that, being a sharp-tail guy for my whole life, prairie chickens don't make noise when they get up very often. Like occasionally, if you're close to them, they'll make, you can hear something, But sharp-tails, when they get up, they're very vocal. They cluck like chickens. Prairie chickens do not make that noise. And so the first one that got up, and it got up kind of close-ish, but I mean, like a little bit out of range. And I was like, is that a, yeah, that's a prairie chicken right there, but it never made a sound. And then the next one didn't make a sound. The next one. So when you're out there and you're like, if you're a sharp-tail guy and you've never chased chickens before, they look kind of similar. I can pick them out of sometimes, especially in Nebraska and in South Dakota, you can get them in mixed coveys. I can pick out the chickens because they got that big square tail and they don't make any sound. And the sharp tails will almost always cluck like a chicken, and they're white on the breast compared to that beautiful barred pattern. And so when I'm down there chasing them late, I want chickens. I don't want sharp tails. So my experience with that hunt was just a lot of boot leather, the same kind of grass that Marissa's talking about. They were definitely in that taller grass. You'd see clumps, and it was kind of down in Kansas. It was almost like a redder color. I don't know if that's kind of the same stuff you're talking about too, Marissa. It's almost like a little bit taller red colored grass, but almost every chicken we kicked up that day came out of that stuff.
Yeah, and I've definitely, there's a grass known as love grass, and that's another one that I have historically found chickens in, and it's this really pretty, this purple kind of flower on it. It's kind of the soft look, and it'll kind of hang out in the bowls a lot of times. And so I'll definitely hit those areas. When you see some of these, high diverse areas of flowers and grasses, and kind of like what Tyler was saying with edges, I'm going to walk through those, and it's hard sometimes. And when we're talking about burning boot leather, we're talking 10, 15 mile walks a day for some of these birds, because you're going to put in a lot of miles. And so there's sometimes that thought, oh, I'm too tired, I don't want to walk through that thick stuff. It's but really, I mean, when you're seeing that beautiful diversity, definitely take the time to walk through that stuff, because they'll hunker down in there and hold really tight.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you've got any more questions about prairie chickens, be sure to put them in the Q&A below. We're going to circle back here and answer some questions after we get done talking about the Hungarian partridge. Also at the end, we're going to be posting a link where you can enter to win. We're going to be giving away some of the onX Upland X t-shirts. So be sure to sign up and try to win one of those. And again, if people are coming in late, this whole thing will be posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch, go back, and dig in a little deeper. So now transitioning to the Hungarian partridge, which probably, Tyler, it has to be one of your favorite birds.
Yeah, it's in the top two for sure. And it flip-flops depending on the time of the year for me.
So what's the story with the Huns? What are you looking for? It's going to be, obviously different than a Sharpie. Let's hear the lowdown on that.
Yeah. So for Huns, the thing that I'm going to look for, they like agriculture a lot. So you can find them out in the prairie occasionally, but the numbers of them just aren't quite as high as it would be. So this map here that Ben's showing is a really perfect example of a really good looking spot to go chase Huns. So is what I'm looking for. Again, it's all about edges when it comes to this kind of stuff. So all these little low depressions in here, this one here that you're kind of pointing around has been baled. That one's been cut. You can tell, you can see the hay bales on the side. But if you look over at the one just on the other side of it over here to the left, that one hasn't been baled. And those Huns will like spots just exactly like this. So my buddy who's actually out here on the deck, who's going to Arizona with me, he affectionately he came up with the name slooping is how we hunt Huns and pheasants nowadays. So is what we'll do is we'll find a wheat field just like this, and we will just take off right across a full section of wheat, and we'll just hit all these little small objectives across the field. So, and it's not just wheat. Canola is another good one on here that Huns like a lot. They like the smaller grain. They don't really. They'll occasionally eat sunflowers, and actually they like sunflowers quite a bit, even though sunflowers have kind of gone by the wayside a little bit here in the last few years in my part of the world. But out in the small grain fields, the wheat and the canola fields, you just kind of work, and it's beautiful because you can just let the dogs run. And occasionally you'll move a covey right out in the middle of a beautiful golden wheat field. But I'm going to hit all these little small objectives. I'm going to hit all these little trees, all these little contour lines. And I know over in Montana, it's kind of the same. You'll find like a creek draw or a coulee or whatever that runs through an ag field. Those are going to be hot spots that I'm absolutely going to go and check out for hunts. Marissa, coming from down in Nebraska, I'm guessing a lot of this probably sounds a little bit like bobwhites. They're kind of like bobwhites. Like they kind of like those. They like the fence rows and the tree rows and little bushes and slough bottoms and pockets inside of the ag field where they can kind of just, they'll live in that taller, thicker cover. And I mean, and tall, thick cover, neck high. You can find them in the same kind of stuff that you're going to find pheasants in. But is what they'll do is they'll kind of hang out in there during the day, and they'll kind of just walk out to the edge of that stuff and start eating in a wheat field or a canola field in the afternoons. And it's a little bit, I personally kind of like to hunt them in the evenings. I'll go out and I'll chase sharp-tails all afternoon, all day. And then as I'm getting done with my sharp-tail hunting and I want to go and walk something that's not going to probably make my legs feel like they're going to fall off, going up and down those dang hills, I'll just go and take a nice leisurely stroll across a piece of agriculture and just let my dogs go out there and run all the edges of these sloughs, and just trust your dogs. Because unlike sharp-tails, these Huns will absolutely run. And we have put up coveys of Huns 50, 100 yards past where the dog initially went on point. And it's sometimes is what it is those birds have just kind of been loafing out there and they've just kind of been moving around. Or if it's later in the year and that air is kind of heavy, Huns tend to live in bigger family groups. They're a true covey bird. And it's not uncommon to see groups of 15 to 20. And so those dogs, especially as October rolls around, there's no more of that green grass, which I believe causes a lot of what I call nose noise for those dogs. Like when you walk into a slough that's got a bunch of green grass and everything else in it, you can smell it. So that dog can smell it too. So it kind of adds a little bit of a layer of confusion. But as all that stuff dies off and everything starts to turn brown, those dogs have a lot better ability to scent the birds themselves. So if you see a dog kind of on point just out in the middle of a field, get over there, because, and then, I mean, once you get past that and you give them a good little walk up and you're pretty convinced that they're not there anymore and you haven't seen them fly, release that dog and see if they'll start tracking. A lot of times those birds are going to be within 100 yards of you. Sometimes it's because they ran. Sometimes it's just because that dog's got that much scent in its nose. It can't really tell exactly where those birds are at, and they're just being cautious.
So, you touched on it a little bit. But what, a lot of Montana, you're going to have maybe less ag, a lot more just big rolling grassland, rangeland areas. Is that kind of like just throw a dart on the map, or are there specific things that you can kind of target within those open grasslands?
Yeah, I've had limited success in the kind of the open grasslands. I mean, they're certainly there. Again, it's going to kind of depend a little bit on the time of the year. So if it's early in the year and they're still feeding on bugs, you're going to be looking for that taller grass kind of in the lower areas that are going to have all that insect life. Maybe there's a little bit of water close by or something like that. It's not necessarily the water that's a deal breaker for them, but that's where all the insect life is going to be. So out there in that big wide open vastness of Montana, you're still going to kind of look for kind of the edges, and you're going to find like old abandoned farmsteads and pockets of bushes and stuff like that. And you can absolutely find them in there. But when I've hunted them in Montana, and I know when you've hunted them in Montana, a lot of that stuff, though, they're going to be kind of close to some sort of agriculture. I mean, if you really kind of want to put the odds in your favor, you're going to be looking for big coulees and draws that go through some sort of an ag field, and they can be any place inside that draw. The other thing that you can find in Montana or in North Dakota, which are two of the better states for chasing Huns in, are tree rows that go through ag fields. So, I mean, I personally hate to hunt tree rows. I don't like it. It's not fun for me because I don't like walking in a straight line, having one person on one. And if you're only hunting by yourself, good luck. I mean, you need to have your dog as a partner in that, because you need your dog to know enough to run on the downwind side of a tree row, and you need to stay on the upwind side, because those birds are going to be very reluctant to flush out over top of a dog. But like, my dogs run big, So when I'm in a tree row, it's kind of a pain in the butt because a tree row, and a lot of times they're going to be a half or a quarter mile long. And my dogs will run up one side on the downwind side of a tree row, and then they'll come back down at downwind side of the next tree row. So is what I'm going to do if I'm hunting tree rows is I'm going to walk. If the tree rows run this way, I'm going to walk this way. And I'm just going to kind of keep on walking, and I'm going to trust my dogs to run those edges and see if there's any birds in them. But it can be very effective, and especially for those guys out there that are thinking about hunting Huns with flushing dogs. Same with sharp-tails. You can find sharp-tails in those tree rows too. But if you have a flushing dog like a lab or something like that, this is going to be your bread and butter if you're going to want to try to get out there and hunt some Huns.
Another question is, so, you know, a lot of what we're talking about here is making me think of good pheasant habitat. Mm-hmm. How do the two differ? Do they overlap quite a bit, or
they overlap a lot? Yeah, I think they overlap a lot. When we kind of joke with my group of friends that come up here in October, we don't actually go hunting pheasants. We go hunting Huns, and we just shoot pheasants. I mean, you're going to find the Huns in the tall cattails and in that buckbrush kind of cover, the slough bottoms, and you'll find the Huns right on the edge of the same cover. You don't very often flush the Huns out of the cattails, but they're going to certainly be, you know, in that kind of same area. So it makes for a really fun multi-species hunt when you can focus on you can literally walk up on a doggone point on the edge of a wheat field looking down into a big nasty patch of weeds. It can be a covey of Huns or it can be a rooster pheasant. You just don't know.
Yeah, and this is a situation where, at least when I'm out in North Dakota or Montana, where I'm going in on a web map beforehand and just finding a milk run of spots. It's not as much so like a Sharpie. Perfect. Where you can just walk miles. Like, for example, like here's a spot I would go in, drop a waypoint on right in the middle of a wheat field.
Yep.
And then I would go, and this only might be a half-hour walk or 20 minutes, and then I'll go drive the next spot, right? So that's the way at least I hunt them versus I'm going to get on the ground for 4 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a little bit why I try to hunt them a little bit more in the afternoons, because especially in September and early October, I am going to focus on sharp-tails a lot more, because that's kind of the only time that you can really go out and put some sharp-tails down consistently. So I'll hunt sharp-tails in the morning until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or until I get my limit, or whatever the case may be. And then I'll go out and I'll start looking for spots like that, because you're right. Like a long Hun walk is maybe going to be 2 miles. You know, I mean, you can find some spots that are going to be a little bit more or a little bit less, but you can really kind of put the odds in your favor when you're looking at a spot, just like you highlighted there, because those Huns are typically going to be down someplace relatively close to that draw that runs through that egg field. They like having that cover. They're always aware of avian predators, again, just like we were talking about with the sharp-tails. And so they like to feed out in that stuff. And you will find those Huns out in the middle of a wheat field. I mean, I put up lots of coveys just out in the middle. But what they always do, if you put them up out in the middle, is they're flying to a piece of cover that's close by. And so as what's going on is those birds are just kind of out there doing their little partridge thing throughout the day and enjoying life. And then as the evening and the morning comes in, they're going to go back to that thicker cover. And so you can really kind of, just keep on stacking those odds in your favor, and you can kind of bury in onto some of the better spots. But again, just trust your dog. And if you're looking at your dog thinking, what in the heck is he doing way out there in the middle of the field? And you can kind of see him being a little bit weird. He probably is being weird for a reason.
So to kind of recap that, Huns, you're looking for wheat, canola. Mm-hmm. And then looking for kind of weedy, grassy strips going through there, hunting a lot of edges. Yep. That's going to be your bread and butter.
Yep. And I mean, again, everybody's seen the beautiful pictures of the old abandoned farmsteads with the rusty machinery and all that kind of stuff. I personally like to stay away from those spots because they are home to raccoons and skunks and porcupines, and also sharp stuff that hides in tall grass your dogs can run into. So that stuff that a person definitely, you can find birds in those spots. But if you have a really hard charging dog that throws caution to the wind and just goes busting through everything, or those of us who have German dogs of some persuasion or another, Ben, it's a really good spot to end up having to remove porcupine quills, breaking up a fight, or having to use that skunk off kit that you got in the truck.
Yeah. Well, I am guilty as charged with the German dog, the porcupines and skunks, etc. So,
yeah. Yes, Sean. Hour and 20 minutes might be a record for me, man. And it all comes from love. I got a German dog in the house right now. He's going to Alaska with me. I think he self-identifies as an English setter because he doesn't want anything to do with anything with fur, but he loves feathers.
Awesome. Yeah, so we'll take some time to answer some questions now. So if you have any questions you want to get in, be sure to throw them in that Q&A at the bottom there. So I'll start with you, Marissa. Drought, a lot, especially down in your neck of the woods, the last few years, kind of all across the country, there's drought, lack of rainfall. How does that affect the birds, especially, Sharpies and chickens?
Yeah, so it's certainly something that's just a continued struggle, and with that, we've got some fires going on out west in the state. On that note, just so everybody knows, there is that option on onX to have active fires in the area. I really like to include that to my layers if I'm going into an area where I know that there's historically been some fires, or there's specifically a fire that's taking place. And so, we're certainly struggling with that. Some of the struggles that we're going to see is, if there's not enough rain moisture for vegetation, and then there's not enough vegetation for those insects, and it's just this domino effect. So yeah, it can absolutely impact the numbers that you're going to see, the properties that you're going to potentially hunt, depending on haying and grazing as well. So it's always a good idea to scout ahead of time, both using your onX map, but then also checking out some of those places, seeing what they look like in person. You can head out there before the season opens as well. But yeah, it certainly is a struggle. We don't like to see it. And I know everybody out west is holding their breath for some rain here soon.
Yeah. The biggest thing is, for me at least, in where I hunt, is a lot of emergency haying, grazing, which you cannot fault the producers at all, right? Like they've got to make a living, they've got to feed their cattle. But that's a thing where I marked a number of spots in central Montana, went there, and it was like, oh, these are all grazed down. So kind of one of the ways I combat it is I will, mark different areas on different pieces of property. Like if you're focused in on one, let's just say block management area, and you get there and it's like, oh, this whole thing is barren, to go and have different, because like, for example, like state land can be utilized different than private land, right? Block management. So just to have those different options, so you're not stuck with one.
That's a really good point, Ben. When you're going to go on a trip, if you haven't been there before, don't be married to one spot, because you can go and, like, here in this part of the world, same with down there with Marissa, like it can be very localized. You can go 20 miles one way or the other, and it hit all the thunderstorms that came through all season, and it's going to have a lot more bugs and a lot better bird hunting there than there would be just 20 miles to the north or south. So if you like kind of get an idea in your head where, like, geographically in the state you want to go, and then start kind of branching out from there and trying to find where has had a little bit better moisture than others.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, our eastern part of Nebraska has certainly received a significant amount, more rain than the western. And so what areas in the eastern portion of the state, and we do have the option of an eastern prairie grouse permit that's free. It's just we have a limited number of them that's different. And so adapting based on conditions, and to that point too, if there's an area that historically these birds have been, look around, like what are some of the properties that are nearby that they could have moved to then that haven't been grazed or hayed, or There's pivot corners and other things that you can kind of look for in some of those areas too.
And one other thing that I before I forget, I wrote this down right at the beginning of this. And I really can't stress this enough. When you guys check out onX and you're looking at some of these areas to go to, we all like to hunt public ground. Like I hunt a ton of waterfowl production areas and plots and everything else throughout the year, block management, Montana, everything else. Don't be afraid to look at a landowner group in those areas and go and knock on a door. Like, is what I'm going to do if I'm going to go to a state is I'm going to look up and see on onX if there's one family or one name that keeps on popping up in an area that I'm looking around. And you can go and knock on a door, and a lot of these guys, they might have it posted or not allow deer hunting. But if you're going in there asking to go and chase sharp-tails and chickens or huns, they'll be like, yeah, go nuts, go have fun.
You want to do what? You want to hunt those birds?
Yeah, you want to walk 15 miles to shoot those things? Yeah, I do. But I mean, like, it's worth a knock on the door. I mean, the worst they're going to say is no. And a lot of times these guys, they really kind of enjoy that interaction, and they'll give you really good advice on where to go, all that kind of stuff. So definitely look for a spot that's got a good amount of public land that you can go and hunt in a good area in a state, whichever state it may be. But just don't forget about those private landowners too, and use that private landowner information layer that you guys got on a map. Make a few phone calls and knock on some doors. You'll be surprised what opens up to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of us think public, but especially when it comes to birds, a lot of people are very willing to give you permission to hunt. So this is an interesting one, and I don't know the answer. So when you're looking at huns, let's just say last year they were in one area, and I think we were talking about this actually before we started, but let's just say they were on the edge of a wheat field in this one area, and this coming year that wasn't planted, or it was planted in beans or corn. Generally, how far will those birds move year to year?
Not super far. If you find a covey of huns in one area, I don't know if it's a quarter mile around or how big their home range is. I mean, it can certainly be bigger than that depending on the population density. But if you found huns in one spot, it's definitely worth going and checking out that same area. We were talking about it before we got on the air. Just north of me a little ways, there's a bush in a field that I've hunted since I was 8 years old. And every year, with a fairly good degree of certainty, I take people up there and I'll just tell them, all right, we're going to crest up over top this hill and there's a bush. As soon as we get up close to that bush, the dogs are going to go on point. There's going to be a covey of huns there. And I'm right like 80% of the time. I mean, it's pretty spooky. So, and also the other thing is, if you find an area that's got one really nice size covey of huns in it, say you jump a covey of 16 birds, something like that, and then all those conditions were really good the following year, I'm going to go back to that same area, and you're probably not going to find one covey. You're probably going to find 3 or 4, because every time you find a covey, you've missed several. And if the habitat's good enough to support one healthy family group like that, it's definitely healthy enough to support multiple family groups like that. And so as what happens in late February and early March, those huns will start to pair up. And then I actually really like driving around that time of the year, and every place I see a pair of huns, I'm dropping a pin on onX. I could show you my screen right now. It's hilarious. I have color codes. I have different.
Please show us your screen.
All right. I will. It's hilarious in this area. I'm going to zoom out so nobody can see any particular one. But here, this is Western North Dakota right there.
That's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. It's color coded. It's got all kinds of different stuff going on it. But I'll go out there in late February, early March, and every place that I see a pair of huns, I'm dropping a pin, because there's going to be a covey someplace relatively close to that area. I mean, and relatively can be a quarter mile, half mile, whatever it might be, but there's going to be a covey of huns someplace close by. So if you find coveys in one field one year, it's definitely worth going back and checking it out again.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Marissa, like in your experience, and this is probably different from Tyler, just being different, different latitudes, but when do Sharpies, prairie chickens kind of transition from that insects to berries or other types of vegetation?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly, some of it's going to depend on when that first freeze is. which is really challenging. And it's also going to depend on, your young birds, your first of the year birds versus some of your older birds. Those first of the year birds are, primarily on that buggy diet for a while. But I would say really it's a safe bet and an easy answer to just when that freeze starts to hit, that they are going to transition into that. Now, that being said, I mean, I've opened crops where there's, an early season when you're getting, all those grasshoppers, and I'm still seeing rose hips. I'm still, seeing some of those berries. So it's not that they're completely avoiding those things early season. It's just predominantly insects. But that first freeze is a really good indicator. That's also usually a good indicator of you're going to have a lot more challenging of a hunt. And as Tyler says, September, October, those are prime prairie grouse dates to hunt. September can be really tricky. People just have to be really careful with themselves and their dogs, because not only is it horrifically hot, but that sand and other material, the soil, the ground, everything can get really hot, and your dog's pads can get burned. I mean, there's a lot of different factors
Rattlesnakes.
to it.
You can worry about rattlesnakes that time of year for sure.
I did make a note, and I think I saw somebody asked a question about that too. So, that's definitely, knock on wood, I have yet to run into one in the sandhills in Nebraska, or when I visited North Dakota. But yeah, that's a real concern. So, each early season, late season come with their pros and their cons for sure. But I guess specifically getting back to the question, Ben, I would say that first freeze, and you can start really seeing that transition.
Up here in North Dakota, you can, I mean, it's not a given, but you can say before September or before October 1st and after. I mean, it's certainly definitely weather dependent. I mean, October 1st last year up here was like 99 degrees. But generally by that time of the year, we've had a freeze, and they will actually continue to eat dead grasshoppers for a little while after that, as long as they can find them. But you just kind of got to watch the weather.
Awesome. Yeah. What I've seen a lot of the time is they're equally feeding on, hoppers versus chokecherry, buffalo berry. Kind of going back to our point earlier, is earlier in the day, I'll see them feeding a lot more on hoppers, and then really transitioning to berries, probably because it's hot, early season, getting some more of that, thermal cover, and getting out of the element. So
for sure.
Awesome. Well, we are about at time. So I really appreciate both of you coming on. I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone out there learned a lot. We're going to post a link here in the chat if you want to sign up and win an onX Upland XT. If people want to get a hold of you guys, is there a great way, whether it's social media or whatnot, that they can ask you questions, pick your brain?
I personally use Instagram a lot. If everybody wants to go to Birds, Booze, and Buds podcast on Instagram, I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to put a little caveat on that, though. As I'm driving across Canada and Alaska, I don't know what my cell phone service is going to be like. So if you guys have questions, and if I don't get a chance to answer them, I will get back to you, or just remind me, because I got a lot of stuff going on here for the next couple of weeks. But I'm always happy to answer questions on Instagram.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and add my email address here in the chat, just for people who are maybe tuning in afterwards. It's mjensen@pheasantsforever.org. But I'm also going to give my Instagram handle, because it's very specific to my love for grouse hunting and the sandhills, and it's rose hips and turtles. And if you want to know why it's turtles, you can shoot me a message and ask me, but it's all around the sandhills and grouse habitat, and my love for those places.
Well, awesome. Again, I cannot thank you two enough. This has been fantastic. I love it. I've seen a number of questions about, in terms of, I want to see this masterclass for pheasant, for grouse. Be sure to follow the schedule. I think they're both in September. We're going to be talking about grouse, woodcock, pheasants, quail, everything. So be sure, I think the link is onxmaps.com/hunt/masterclass. I'd be really impressed if that's right, but just Google onX Masterclass. You'll be able to find upcoming webinars. So again, thank you guys. Thank you everyone for coming, and we hope you have a fantastic season and hopefully it's successful.